we are going to be talking about developmental psychology. When we talk about developmental psychology, we are talking about the physical, meaning the body, the cognitive, meaning the mind, and the social, meaning the way that we relate to others. All three of those things, the physical, cognitive, and social changes that take place from birth to death. So we're basically looking at the lifespan and how we change and how we stay the same during that period of time. That's what we mean by developmental psychology. When we look at developmental psychology in general, we are looking at three major issues. The first one is nature versus nurture. And of course, what we mean by nature is how much of us is our genetic inheritance, and how much of what makes up who we are is actually because of nurture, meaning not inborn issues, but issues of learning, issues of experience. Okay? The second major issue, and the second major thing we're going to be looking at in developmental psychology, is continuity versus stages. This is a little bit more confusing. By continuity, we mean to what degree is our change gradual and continuous throughout life, kind of like this, and to what extent do we change in stages? In other words, we're an elementary student, and then boom, we're a middle school student, and then boom, we're a high school student. Okay? If you relate that to cognitive changes, it could be we understand this, and then all of a sudden we have a new understanding of the way things work, and then all of a sudden, so we almost bump up in stages rather than this continuity or this continual gradual change throughout life. The third issue we're going to look at across a number of different issues is stability versus change. How much through the lifespan do we stay the same? Is the personality that we have at 3 years of age the same personality that we have at 65 years of age? That would be stability. Change, of course, would be the changes that take place between being a 3-year-old and being a 65-year-old. And those are probably a lot easier to put your finger on. But think again of the physical, the cognitive, and the social changes that take place across the lifespan. If you come down here, we need to real quickly talk about how experimentation takes place when we're talking about developmental psychology. It's a little bit different than the experimentation that we did in other chapters, or research that we did in other chapters. The first type of research that you're going to see is longitudinal research. Longitudinal research would be where we would take a case study, an individual person or a group of people, and we would study them at age 2, age 4, age 6, in any particular area that we might be measuring. Okay? The advantage to that is that you get very accurate research because you are dealing with the same individual at different stages of their life. The disadvantage, obviously, is if you want to follow a child from age 2 to age 60, then that's going to take you 58 years. So this can be very slow. The second type of research we're going to be looking at is what's called cross-sectional research, and cross-sectional is exactly what it says. It's when you take a cross-section of the population. So in other words, you study a group of 2-year-olds, and then you study a group of 4-year-olds, and you study a group of 6-year-olds, and you try to control for variables. You try as much as possible to get people that are very similar in experience. The problem is you're going to get many confounding variables in there because people are different because of their experiences, because of their genetics, and so on. And so you're going to have some issues of both change and stability that you're not sure exactly why those changes are taking place. Next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to start off in developmental psychology talking about newborns. Used to be, years ago, that people thought that newborns were very simple and there wasn't a whole lot to them in terms of their cognitive development and their physical development and that kind of thing. That's changed quite a bit. When babies are born, the first thing I want to take a look at is reflexes. Reflexes that babies are born with. Because human beings are cognitively very high creatures. In other words, because they're able to do quite a bit of frontal lobe thinking and planning and so on, they are born with very few reflexes. Okay? In other words, if you had a lizard, for instance, a lizard would be born with quite a few reflexes or instincts that would help that lizard stay alive. In human beings, some of these basic reflexes we're going to look at real quickly. The first one is rooting. Rooting is when we look at young babies, babies will tend to, if their cheek is stimulated, they will tend to turn their heads towards whichever side is being stimulated. So if I was to stimulate the cheek of this baby here, the baby would turn its head this way to the right, okay? Generally looking to feed. Along that same thinking, another reflex of babies is the ability to suck. Babies are able to actually control the muscles in both their throat and in their mouth, and they're able to control their breathing in such a way that they can take in nutrients. That is not something that is learned, that is something that is inherently in them, so that would actually be an issue of nature. Actually, all of these are. The third reflex we need to talk about is what's called the Moro reflex. If a baby is startled or scared, a baby will throw its arms out and then quickly throw actually all its limbs out, its arms and its legs. It will throw them out to the side and then it will pull back in to protect itself. That happens also if a baby is dropped. If you turn a baby over on its back and you hold the baby up and you drop the baby down a little bit, obviously not to the floor, drop the baby down a little bit, the baby will throw out its arms, it will throw out its legs to protect itself. That is what is called the Moro reflex. The next one is what's called the Babinski reflex. The Babinski reflex says that if you were to stimulate the bottom of a baby's foot, if you tickle the bottom of a baby's foot, that baby will actually come towards you with its foot and spread its toes out like this. It will fan its toes out. Okay? That's very different neurologically than what an adult would do, or even what a 2-year-old would do. If you were to tickle a 2-year-old's foot, that 2-year-old would pull its foot away. And pediatricians will actually check for neurological development in babies by stimulating the bottom of their foot. If at the age of 2 a baby is still fanning its feet out and actually pushing into stimulation, there's probably going to be a question there of neurological development. The last of the reflexes that we're going to look at is gripping. Obviously, you guys know what gripping is. If you were to take your finger and stick it inside a baby's hand, that baby would grip, okay, or grab onto your hand. Sometimes to the point where if you were to take 2 fingers and give it to a young baby and allow them to grip, you could slowly lift the baby up off the crib, okay, just slightly, because their grip is so compelling. If you come down here, we're going to look secondarily, when we talk about the competent newborn, we're going to look at the social responsiveness of newborns. This is where, I said before, there's been a lot of new research about babies and a lot of new understanding about what babies understand and so on. Just before we get to this, let's just swing out to the side here and look at the 5 senses of the baby. Of course, we have smell, hearing, sight, taste, and touch as the 5 basic senses. In terms of smell, a baby's, in fact, let's just blanket this and say that all of the senses are completely developed at birth with one exception, and that one exception is sight. Okay? A baby cannot see the way that an adult sees until about 12 months. Once a baby hits a year, a baby fully has its sight the way an adult does. That really zips forward between 6 months and a year. In terms of smell, a baby is able to socially smell its mother and tends to prefer its mother to other people, okay, even to the father. The same thing is true with hearing. Babies hear very well. They actually hear within the womb, and they tend to respond to their mother's voice over anybody else's voice as newborns. With sight, like we said, babies do not have very good sight. They can see shapes, they can see movement, okay, and they can see color. It's just not real focused. It's very interesting that some studies have been done. Babies' eyesight does tend to focus right around somewhere between 8 and 12 inches away, okay, from their eyes is where they tend to focus. So they see things pretty sharp right at that distance away from their face. If you get further away, things tend to get very blurry. There's a lot of thinking that that is because that is about the approximate distance from a woman's breast to her eyes, and so the baby is actually interacting with the mother by looking at the mother's face, and it's very likely that that is the reason for that. In terms of social responsiveness, there is actually a developmental psychologist by the name of Fons, and he did some research in 1961. And what he came up with, he gave babies 3 different things to look at. Okay? This is babies less than 3 months. And he came up with some interesting data here. When babies looked at imitations of faces, or they looked at patterns, different types of patterns, this particular one is kind of a spiral, or just flat colored discs, okay? The babies tended to like and to look the longest at faces. That's not really surprising. That talks about the social development of babies. A baby from the very earliest age is looking for eyes and a mouth. They're looking for a face, and they tend to be most interested in faces. Secondarily, babies tend to like patterns. They will stare longer at patterns than non-patterns, okay, but shorter than they will at faces. And third and last, a baby will look at a solid shape, okay, for the shortest period of time of those 3 things. So again, in terms of social responsiveness, the baby is seeking social interaction from the very beginning. They most prefer pictures of faces. One last issue that I want to cover with infants here is this idea of infantile amnesia. Amnesia, of course, we know, we talked about this in the section on memory, but amnesia is when we forget as human beings something that has taken place before. It is pretty much across the board that, in terms of research, it's pretty much understood that the age of 3 is about the earliest people are able to remember. Now that may be slightly different in terms of maturation. Okay, for some people it may be 2.5, for some people it may be age 4. But 3 is kind of a target range. We don't, as human beings, tend to remember things that happened to us before the age of 3. There are a couple different modern theories on that. Sigmund Freud had a whole different theory about that, but the modern theories tend to fall into 2 categories. One of them is that before the age of 3, we have not truly developed a sense of self, and therefore we have nothing to attach our memories to. I don't want to go into too much depth there. The second theory on this is that before the age of 3, because we have not developed speech, we think entirely different after the age of 3, after we fully have our sentences and our syntax and so on, and our language is not just telegraphic in nature. After the age of 3, we tend to think in words, and it is very possible that because of that, we cannot go back neurologically before that. It's almost as if the brain has gone through this evolution, and we can't access memories from before that point. This is terribly troubling to parents, of course. If a parent is lost before the age of 3, very often the child will have no memory of that parent.